Okay, hello friends, and welcome to the first of our July Sunday specials, a month of unique public shiurim on a variety of topics from leading chachamim and academics from around the world, taking place before we launch our new and exciting membership program in September. Tonight we have the privilege of having with us Dr. Robert Brody, who will be presenting on the Geonim, the chachamim of Sepharadim, and the link between them. Dr. Brody has a PhD in mathematics from Harvard University and a doctorate in Talmud from the Hebrew University. He is an expert on the Geonim and Babylonian Jewry, the author of the Geonim of Babylonia and the Shaping of Medieval Jewish Culture, and is an immensely important resource in the field. It is an honor to have him with us. As usual, tonight's class is being recorded and will be available later. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and hopefully we'll also have time for questions at the end. With that said, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you so much, Dr. Brody. It is an honor, and the floor is yours.
Pleasure to join you. I should just say, I think that when I sent the message, I spelled Chabura with an extra H at the end, so you may not get it. So perhaps I should send it again without that extra H. Have you received that file?
Yes, correct. It's without the H at the end.
All right, I will send once again. Back here. So, good evening. First of all, let me say that I'm sorry that Rabbi Dweck is unavailable this evening. I was looking forward to conducting this as a conversation with him, but I will try to do my best without him. So I was asked to speak to you about connections between Sepharadim and Geonim, and perhaps I will begin by saying a few words about those two terms. The term Sepharadim is imprecise. What it implies is people, Jews with roots in Spain, which was identified in the Middle Ages as the biblical Sepharad. But of course, there are many people who would associate themselves as Sephardim, whose ancestors were never located in Spain. There were many other Jewish communities, such as North Africa. Now, it's true that when the Jews were expelled from Spain, many of them went to North Africa and joined the existing communities there, but there were also very major communities that never passed through Spain. The other term, which is widely used, at least in Israel, in talking that overlaps with what are called Sephardim, or perhaps is synonymous, would be Edot HaMizrach, the Eastern communities, which is also an imprecise term, since many of the communities in question are located far to the west of Eretz Yisrael, let's say, far to the west of Bavel. It's not totally clear to me where that nomenclature comes from. I think, do we mean, when we talk about Sephardim, are we saying those Jews who are not Ashkenazim? Ashkenazim is perhaps easier to define a little more strictly, since I think the Jews who identify as Ashkenazim probably do have roots going back to France, Germany, England, the part of Western Europe that was identified as Greater Ashkenaz, or to the offshoots of that community in places like Poland and later Russia. But I think the really relevant categories, for, at least from my perspective, are talking about the Jews whose ancestors lived at some point in their past under Islam, and the Jews whose ancestors lived under Christianity. So the Islamic world during the period of the Geonim and later extended beyond Eretz Israel and Bavel to the east, and to the west encompassed North Africa and Spain, and later with the Reconquista in Spain, that territory was removed from the Islamic Empire, but it stayed until today, encompassing North Africa and territories to the east. And when I talk about the Geonim, perhaps I should also give a definition for that term. What I mean by the Geonim is specifically the heads of the central yeshivot in Babylonia, in Bavel, during what we call the Geonic period, which ran roughly from the middle of the perhaps 6th century to the middle of the 11th century. So during this time, there were also there was a yeshiva in Eretz Israel, the head of which also bore the title of Gaon, but we know a great deal more about the yeshivot of Bavel than we do about the yeshiva of Eretz Israel, which is a point that I'll probably come back to later. And what I'm talking about will be primarily the Babylonian Geonim, the heads of the famous yeshivot that were called after the towns of Sura and Pumbedita, although at a later point in the Geonic period, they actually relocated and were located in Baghdad. The well-known background to this question of connections between Sepharadim and Geonim is that during this period, there were much closer ties between the academies in Babylonia and those parts of the Jewish world which were under Islamic government. And especially, we know especially about ties to Northern Africa and Spain. Many of the shuvot, of the responsa that were written by the Babylonian Geonim, were sent to these communities. Now, we also have a great many responsa for which we don't have that kind of information, but for the ones where we do know where the questions originated, where the answers were sent, that was usually either in Northern Africa or in Spain. Perhaps the most famous example being the Seder of Amram, the Sidur Tfilah that was sent in the middle of the 9th century, which was addressed to scholars in Barcelona. There are a great many other examples. I don't want to give the wrong impression that the Babylonian academies had connections only within the Islamic world. Certainly, communication with the Jewish communities that were under the same umbrella of Islamic government was much easier and more common, but we all know that the Geonim of Babylonia also had some correspondence with Jews living in European, perhaps also other lands that were under Christian control. I'm going to be talking about the Sepharadim, and basically not much later than the Geonic period. So I'm draw the line essentially with the Rambam, and I will later on be talking specifically about some of the ways in which I see close connections between the Babylonian Geonim and the Rambam. But before that, I'll talk in somewhat more general terms. The prevailing theory in talking about the origins of the Jewish communities in the Middle Ages in Europe is that the community in Ashkenaz has its roots in Eretz Israel via Italy. We know that there were close ties between Eretz Israel and Italy going back to the time when they were both part of the Byzantine Empire. And we know that many of the founders and most prominent early Jewish settlers in Ashkenaz came from Italy. So the generally accepted approach is to say that the Ashkenazic Jews have their roots in Eretz Israel, whereas the Sephardic Jews or the Jews of North Africa and Spain have their cultural roots in Bavel. So in a general sort of way, we would expect to find that there would be greater cultural similarities between, on the one hand, Bavel and North Africa / Spain, and on the other hand, between Eretz Israel and Ashkenaz. The picture, some of the ways in which the connections between Eretz Israel and Ashkenaz are generally understood to express themselves include the very strong position given to custom, to minhag, which seems to enjoy a privileged position both in Eretz Israel, going back to the time of the Yerushalmi, and later in medieval and post-medieval Ashkenaz. There's also another striking example is the place that piyut plays in both of these cultures. There is, of course, later piyut finds a place in Sephardi culture as well, but a much more prominent place in Ashkenazi culture. So these are some of the points that are generally understood as being holdovers or part of the Palestinian legacy of Ashkenazi Jewry. Now, the picture is more complicated than that for a number of reasons. One of them being that, as I said earlier, our knowledge of Eretz Israel in the Gaonic period is much more limited than our knowledge of Bavel. Beyond that, it appears there is good reason to think that by the end of the Gaonic period, the dividing lines between the Jewish life, the Jewish culture of Eretz Israel and of Bavel were much less sharply drawn than they had been earlier, which is to say, in the earlier period, Bavel seems to have concentrated almost exclusively on Talmud and Halacha, whereas the sages of Eretz Israel were engaged in a much wider range of intellectual activities in things like Midrash and Piyut, and probably various disciplines associated with Bible, language, etc. By the end of the Geonim period, most of these things had made their way to Bavel to a greater or lesser extent. And conversely, the Babylonian expertise in Talmud and Halakha had led to a large-scale adoption of the Babylonian tradition in Eretz Israel itself and in territories that had been under the influence of Eretz Israel. So when you, for example, the kind of obvious point might be that we know that at an early period, the tradition in Eretz Israel, the Amidah had literally, the weekday Amidah had literally 18 blessings, whence the name Shmona Esrei, whereas in the Babylonian tradition, there were actually 19 blessings. And nowadays, and for a long time past, all Jewish communities have adopted the Babylonian practice in this and related areas. Similarly, we know that in early times, the Babylonians completed the reading of the Torah in an annual cycle, and the Palestinians completed the reading of the Torah in a triennial cycle. Once again, it's been a long time since any Jewish community followed the triennial custom that was the ancient Palestinian custom, as far as we know. In fact, there is evidence, some of which has come to light only quite recently, that even within Eretz Israel, the Babylonian Talmud itself, by the end of the Geonim period, had achieved a very prominent and perhaps preeminent position as against the Palestinian Talmud. Some of the other ways in which we can see continuity between Bavel and the Sephardi tradition of the Middle Ages would be in areas like a rational or rationalizing approach to theology, which was something that was championed by the later Geonim and afterwards pursued by outstanding sages in the Sephardi tradition, and basically not to be found in the Ashkenazi world. The kind of biblical exegesis that was practiced in the Sephardi realm harks back to the kind of exegesis that was done by the later Geonim, and again, rather strikingly different from Ashkenazi biblical exegesis. I'm going to talk now pretty much for the rest of my time, perhaps leaving some time for questions at the end, but I want to talk about the area of Talmud and Halakha, which is the one that I know the most about and am most interested in. And I want to talk about what I see as being very important commonalities between Babylonia and Sepharad in this area. And in contrast to the Ashkenazi world, certainly from the time of the Tosafot, it's less clear where people like Rashi stood on some of the questions that I'm going to talk about. But you can see very sharp contrasts between, on the one side, the Geonim of Babylonia and the early Sephardi sages like the Rif and the Rambam. And on the other side, the Baalei Tosafot. The picture becomes less clear in later Sepharad because beginning from the 13th century, there's a very significant influx of Ashkenazi Torah into Spain, so that the later Sephardi tradition is an amalgam of early Gaonic / Spanish or Sephardi tradition and the Ashkenazi learning of the Baalei Tosafot. So I'm going to draw my line ending with the Rambam, and basically I'm actually going to speak for purposes of simplification and keeping this within time bounds. I'm going to talk about the Rambam and the Geonim, and the essential distinction that I want to make is that the Baalei Tosafot essentially treated all parts of the Talmud as having equal weight. And you can picture this as having both a horizontal and a vertical dimension, by which I mean the horizontal dimension might be that what is found in any passage of the Talmud should be reconciled with what's found anywhere else in the Talmud. And of course, we know that that's perhaps the most characteristic activity of the Tosafot, is to say, well, this discussion in Masechet Shabbat doesn't seem to agree with the discussion in Masechet Gittin, and how can we interpret these two sources in such a way that they're aligned or not in contradiction to each other. And what I mean by the vertical dimension is that within a single Talmudic sugya, all the different elements are treated as being equally weighty. That is to say, a statement made by Rav or Rav Yosef or Rava, and a question raised by the Talmud, and an answer that's suggested by the Talmud, or an observation based on one of these statements. As far as the Baalei Tosafot are concerned, all of these are equally valid sources of halakha. Whereas for the Geonim and for the Rambam, distinctions are to be made between different parts of the Talmud, and not all of them carry equal weight. Perhaps it would be fair to say that not all of them necessarily carry any weight at all when it comes to deciding the halakha. And I think that these differences derive from a very fundamentally different understanding of what the Talmud is and the way that it works. And I think the Gaonic, early Sephardi understanding of the nature of the Talmud would include such ideas as many of the answers that are suggested in the Talmud are meant as possibilities rather than necessarily the right answers. So, for example, one of the things that goes on almost on every page of the Talmud is that a sage's opinion will be criticized on the grounds that what this Amorah said contradicts or seems to contradict a Tannaitic source and the rules of Talmudic discourse. I'm simplifying a little, but the basic assumption is that Amoraim don't argue against Tanaim, and so when such a contradiction or putative contradiction is raised, the common strategy is to say, well, that either that Tannaitic source refers to some special circumstances, or the Amora was talking about some special circumstances, or both. And as long as the two sources refer to different sets of circumstances, there's no contradiction between them. Now, often these explanations strike the reader as far-fetched, and I would argue that in the Geonic understanding of the Talmud, the Talmud wasn't necessarily claiming that this was the correct authoritative understanding of a given source. The point was to say, since there are ways of resolving this contradiction, and here's one, for example, the Amoraic statement is allowed to stand because it's no longer contradicted by the Tannaitic source. But it may be that there are other ways of resolving that tension, and sometimes the Gemara says that explicitly. So I for the Tosafists, when someone says you resolve this contradiction by making the text refer to a particular set of circumstances, they took that to be the definitive explanation of that text. And this leads to a great many differences in actually understanding the discussion and in deciding the halacha. And just more or less as an aside, I would say that probably many of you are familiar with the fact that much of the commentary on the Mishneh Torah for the last 800 years has centered around what are perceived as contradictions between different decisions of the Rambam, on the basis that in one place he accepts an opinion which the Talmud says is associated with a certain principle, and in another place he accepts an opinion which the Talmud says is associated with a different principle, or he accepts a source according to what seems to be its plain meaning, rather than the way that the source is interpreted in order to avoid a contradiction with some other source. And my argument would be that this whole commentary tradition has been troubled by these so-called contradictions within the Rambam, because it's operating with some fundamental assumptions that the Rambam didn't share. And so I'm going to talk briefly now about a couple of Geonic sources and a few sources in the Rambam, and try to show how they have these principles in common. And here's where I would appreciate the file being shared, if that's possible.
1 second, we'll set that up.
Right, so I'm going to show you two Geonic sources. What you see now in front of you is the Talmud source on Shvuot 45b, and there's a very long and complicated discussion, which we don't have time to go into in detail. But the Talmud claims that both Rami Bar Chama and Rava accept the idea that if a person, as you see at the end, according to this Talmudic discussion, both Rami Bar Chama and Rava agree that if someone deposits articles for safekeeping with another person, and he does so in the presence of witnesses, the person who's caring for this property need not find witnesses when he returns the property. That is to say, he would be believed if he later claims that he returned the property to the owner, not in the presence of witnesses. However, if a document was drawn up documenting the fact that this property had been given to him for safekeeping, he would need to find witnesses when he wants to return the property to its owner, and otherwise he wouldn't be believed. This comes up against a sugya, another Talmudic discussion in Baba Batra, which seems to, or fairly clearly says that, in fact, one need not return the property in the presence of witnesses. And Rav Shri Gaon was asked about this. And what he does is quite remarkable. He says that when the sugya in Shvuot says, draws the conclusion that Rami Bar Chama and Rava both agree that if the property was handed over in the presence of witnesses, it need not be returned in the presence of witnesses, but if it was documented in a written document, it does need to be returned in the presence of witnesses. He describes how Rava criticized Rami Bar Chama, and we're now down at the bottom of that page and continuing on to the next page. I see. I think, unfortunately, you've lost the bold that I put into the text. So he says, let's stop there, or go up even a little bit. He explains how Rava was criticizing Rami Bar Chama, v'dachak Rami Bar Chama nafshe, and Rami Bar Chama was forced into a corner, and the only way that he was able to answer Rava's criticism was to say that this must refer to a specific set of circumstances. And then Rava continued to criticize him. Ahadarle Rava hechid afkila be'edim, a couple of lines further down. And dachakan nami Rami Bar Chama lemilte. Once again, Rami Bar Chama was forced to contort himself. Dalash kach peruka. The Kibla al Nafshe, he wasn't able to find a distinction, and therefore he had to agree, admit. V'amar de'itli an palachayu v'shua da'oraita let ba'migu kolikar. He found some very specific set of circumstances in which he said that it would be possible to have a shvua da'oraita v'hacha ishtik Rava mineh. And at this point, Rava was silent. And if we go down towards the end of the next paragraph, about 5 lines from the bottom of the page, V'hai deka amrinan michlal d'tirvayu sfira lahu amavkida tzal chavero b'shtar tzarich lachzir lo b'shtar lav milta psiktahi ela hachin kamrinan. He says the conclusion of the Gemara that both of them agree as to the principle that I mentioned earlier. This is not a certain thing, a decided thing, but rather this is what we're saying. Since Rava was quiet at this point, since he didn't specifically say that he rejected Rami Bar Chama's answer, so we could say that he agrees with Rami Bar Chama on this question. But now Rav Shrira is going to offer an alternative, which is not the one that the Talmud says. V'it l'memer de la svirale. V'haydishtik, de la shmata amar Rami Bar Chama de lifli galei, ela d'chiyata ba'ama madchi l'davar dachuk batel umitli behevel. He says that we could offer another suggestion. The reason that Rava broke off the argument at this point was that he was fed up with Rami Bar Chama's ridiculous answers. And at this point, he decided it wasn't worth arguing with him any further. And that's essentially what Rav Shrira sets up in opposition to the explanation in the Talmud, and then says, and therefore, since we have a clear discussion in Baba Batra, that we're going to go with that and ignore what is suggested by the Sugya in Shvuot. The second Geonic text that I want to present, and here I think we're probably running a little short of time, so I'm going to abridge this, but there's a discussion again in Baba Batra, and Rav Papa says that there's a contradiction between two sources, and the Talmud ends the sugya by saying, Kashya, this is difficult, right? So here, then we go down to the responsum of Rav Hai Gaon, as quoted by Rabbeinu Hananel. And again, I will skip down, let's go to the next page. No, perhaps we'll start at a couple of lines before that. This is the famous distinction. Nikitinan merabotenu zal kol hechad amur b'talmud tiyufta diploni tiyufta, but lu divrei misha tiyufta lev legamre. When the Talmud wants to indicate that a position has been rejected, that the critique is irrefutable, the way of doing that is to say tiyufta diploni tiyufta. Heicha de alta b'kashyan lo batlu devarav. Da'amrinan lo havei brira lahon devatlash muazu legamre ela la ishtakach la peruka b'hishata v'talia v'kaima. He says the use of the technical term kashya indicates that this opinion has not been rejected, and the Talmud is hinting at the fact that although at a given moment they didn't have a plausible or acceptable solution to offer, apparently they had a sense that a solution could be found, and therefore the source in question was not being rejected. Ve'hecha dekasha tirvayu ahadade b'ta'amayhu v'la mifrak kushya avdinan kiha betuchta v'chiha betuchta v'la chashinan la'ashkoche v'u ta'ama v'lefarukinu. So this is the really crucial principle here, I think. When two sources contradict each other in terms of their underlying reasoning, with their ta'amim, and this contradiction is not resolved, how are we to proceed? Says Rav Hai Gaon, we basically ignore the reasoning, look at the two sources, follow each one of them in its own context. That is to say, if they relate to two different circumstances, two different contexts, and the Talmud explains the underlying reasoning of one source as being A, and of the other source as being not A, and we haven't suggested a resolution of the difficulty. We simply ignore the explanations and follow each source in its proper context. And we don't have to worry about finding an explanation and resolving the seeming contradiction. So what I'm going to claim is that these principles can be found in operation in the Rambam. And I'll give again 2 examples. The first example, which has been discussed by others, especially Levinger in his book on the Rambam's halachic thought, pointed out this example. The famous question of mitzvot tzrichot kavanah is intention to fulfill a mitzvah a necessary component? Or suppose that I do the proper action, but not thinking about its significance as the performance of a mitzvah, or perhaps having something completely different in mind. Have I fulfilled the mitzvah? And if you ask, did the Rambam think that mitzvot require intention or do not require intention? The answer is neither, because with respect to some mitzvot, his decision is that they do need kavanah, and with respect to other mitzvot, he decides that they don't need kavanah. And this has puzzled generations of commentators. What you have here is the Magid Mishnah. ואני תמה בדברי רבנו שהוא פוסק פרק 60 הלכות חמץ ומצה, שאם אכל מצה בלא כוונה שיצא ידי חובתו, וזה נראה בגמרא שהוא כדעת מי שאומר מצוות אין צריכות כוונה. ואם כן, איך פסק כאן רבנו שמצוות צריכות כוונה? So the answer, as I say, when it comes to blowing the shofar, the Rambam says that kavanah is a necessary component. When it comes to eating matzah, he says that it's not a necessary component. If you ignore the attempts of the Gemara to provide an overarching principle, and you simply look at each of these discussions in isolation, then the Rambam's decisions make perfectly good sense and are exactly what we would expect. And again, I can't go into the details because we're short on time, but if you look at the Talmudic discussion concerning matzah, the one concerning shofar, and the one concerning Kriyat Shema, you will see that the Rambam's halachic decisions in all 3 cases are precisely what we would expect if we ignore the section that puts forward an overarching principle and ties these together under the heading of either mitzvot need kavanah or mitzvot don't need kavanah. And my last example will be another contradiction between 2 sugyot. Well, if you can page further down, please. 2 sugyot, one in Ketubot and one in Kiddushin. Right, so the upshot of, stop and go back a bit, please. So the upshot of the sugya, stop there, please. The upshot of the sugya in Ketubot is Rav Papa argues. Rav Papa is asking Abaye how a particular source could be interpreted. What is taken for granted is that someone who has intercourse with a mamzeret is liable to the punishment of malkot. However, the Rambam decides that this person is not eligible to malkot, and this gives rise to one of the questions of the sages of Lunel. גם נמצא כתוב בספר זה בהרבה מקומות ובשאר ספרים שאין אדם הבעל חייבי להבין חייב מלכות אלא אם כן קידשה. Rambam says that sexual intercourse outside of marriage with a woman who is prohibited with a lav, with a simple negative commandment, is not punishable by malkot. והגענו הרבה ולא מצאנו זה מאין לך. רק מצאנו קושיה גדולה בראש פרק אלו נערות שיש להם קנס. That's the discussion in tractate Ketubot. And the Rambam says, yes, that's a very intelligent question. זאת השאלה בקושיה, ודאי ראויה היא לעיין בה הרבה וחכמים גדולים ככם הם שיקשה להם דבר זה. And he says, actually, when I wrote my first draft, I thought the same way. ובשעה שחיברתי הספר אמרתי בדבר זה כמה ימים, והנוסחה הראשונה הילדה שחיברתי התחילה, שהקציתיה מליבי ולא העתקתיה, היה כתוב בה כפי הנראה מההלכה הזאת, אליבא דרבי יצחק. דהי משנה דאלו נערות. My first draft was in keeping with what you suggest. But then, when I thought about it some more, ובעת שהעתקתי ודקדקתי כל שמועה ושמועה מן הספרים, לא שמעתי ולא שמחתי על קושיה זו. ואמרתי, לא נניח תלמוד ארוך ונפסיק הלכה ממשא ומתן של גמרא. So what the Rambam is saying is, although the line in question is attributed to Rav Papa, it's dialectic. It's not a normative statement. And when I have to weigh that against what the Rambam takes to be a normative statement in Tractate Kiddushin, he says, he lays out here the principle, Talmud Aruch is always to be preferred to Masa Umatan. So again, we have within the Talmud, in the same way that we saw in the Geonic responsum, we have first-class citizens and we have second-class citizens, and whatever qualifies as Talmud Aruch. And if you look carefully at that sugya in Kiddushin, it's actually very interesting that the Rambam considers it to be Talmud Aruch, but because it's offered as a straightforward explanation and not in the context of question and answer, that in his view is preferable and carries greater weight for halachic decision making than Talmudic dialectic, which was what he finds in Tractate Ketubot. So I hope I've succeeded in drawing some lines connecting Geonim and Sepharadim in these very important areas, and perhaps a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. And we have a question I see in the chat. We'll start with Rabbi Phillips, his question, and then we'll move on to the people who raise their hands. Rabbi Phillips, you want to ask your question?
I was going to ask another one just based on something we got to at the end. I'll start with the later one, since it's probably fresh in our minds. So we seem to have a principle here that the Rambam and the Geonim will be posek like a sugya which is clear rather than something which is based on dialectic. How does that weigh up with other principles? For example, we see that the Rambam will be posek like a sugya d'shmaitisa, a sugya which seems to be the focus point of a topic, rather than something which is brought in as a side point. Are those conflicting principles, or?
No, I don't think so. I think that they're perhaps complementary principles. There could certainly be more than one principle at work in weighing these things. Yeah.
Do you have a second question, Rav Phillips?
There was a question from earlier on, the other topic we talked about how there was a change from the 3-year Torah cycle and changes made to the Tefillah 18 and 19 brachot. When exactly did these changes take place, and how do they take place? Was the Babylonians who are forcing their position on those in Eretz Israel, or they came to accept that there's a greater authority or knowledge base elsewhere? How did it come about?
No, well, those are very hard questions to answer. What we do know that Babylonian Jews had been trying for hundreds of years to prevail on Jews in Eretz Israel and Jews elsewhere in the world who had been exposed to the traditions of Eretz Israel, to reject those and adopt the Babylonian tradition. We know this was a battle that had been going on for centuries. My take is that eventually the leaders in Eretz Israel recognized Babylonian superiority in the area of Talmud and Halakha, and accepted various Babylonian positions. We do have documentation, some documentation from Egypt, where there were Babylonian communities and Palestinian communities. And we know that there was a gradual adoption within the Palestinian synagogue of some of these Babylonian practices, specifically with regard to reading the Torah in an annual cycle instead of a triennial cycle. And there's a unique document that was written, if I'm remembering the details correctly, at the beginning of the 13th century, where the leaders of the Palestinian community pledged themselves to maintain their traditions against the encroaching Babylonian traditions. So we could say something about the time frame, but not as much as we would like. As I say, our sources, especially within Eretz Israel, are much more fragmentary than would enable us to really answer those questions.
Thank you.
Ilan?
Hi, Professor Brody. My question is regarding the point you made a few minutes ago about the Shuvot Chukot, the forced answers that the Gemara very frequently gives, and how you were saying that oftentimes it doesn't necessarily mean them as absolute answers, but possibilities. Might it be that sometimes, or at least one motive for the Gemara to give those answers is because nearly or very frequently when it does so, it gives a memra or an older tradition within that answer. So could it be that oftentimes the Gemara gives a Shuvah Chukot in order to get a tradition on the table, a source or a memra on the table, because they would otherwise be forgotten, or it might want to just sort of preserve them in that way? Because the Gemara also is trying to preserve discussions that maybe could have been forgotten.
That's an interesting suggestion, and I can't say that I've thought about that possibility. I can imagine it as a possible motivation, although my impression is a little different than yours. I don't think that that's common when they're offering what I would call an ukimto. That usually takes the form of saying this source refers to circumstances X, Y, Z, rather than citing another memra, another tradition. But there are cases like that, and I could imagine that perhaps in some of those cases that was a reason in favor of suggesting that particular resolution rather than another one. Have to think about it some more.
Even if it might be anonymous, I'm saying. Maybe Mamer was the wrong word, but oftentimes they're anonymous. It could be that it's said it belongs to someone else, who's just not giving the name of that person. But thank you for the answer. I understand.
We have a question in the chat from Simon. Simon, you want to ask your question?
Right, yes. It's that the historiography often tells us that the tradition of old Sepharad is continuous with that of the Geonim, as you have been saying, whereas then the Catalonian school, Nachmanides and Ibn Adret and so on, were importing traditions from the Tosafot, or making a kind of bridge between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that's a little bit at odds with Nachmanides' own claim, which is that he is defending the older Geonim, like the Bahag and the Rif, against what he sees as kind of an over-rationalistic approach of Maimonides, and that he is trying to defend, for example, the Tariag mitzvot as put in the Halachot Gedolot and of those, and so he is claiming to be the defender of the Geonim. Now, is there any sort of truth in that, or do you think that's a kind of apologetic dodge?
I think there is some truth in that. I think that Nachmanides had, as part of his understanding of his own role and his own mission, defending certain great figures from the past, and that's what he does with the Rif in Milchamot Hashem. He has certain heroes who have been subjected to criticism and sees it as his responsibility to defend them against that criticism. But I don't think that contradicts the fact that his own thinking includes elements which have been imported from Ashkenaz, and it's requires a lot of work to try to pin down just how much he will accept from Ashkenaz and in what circumstances. But I think his thinking has clearly incorporated elements of the thinking of the Balei HaTosafot.
Yeah. It just always seems a bit odd when the Rambam claims that he agrees with the Rif on almost everything except perhaps 8 points. And the Ramban also claims to be agreeing with the Rif on practically everything, and yet they're almost always disagreeing with each other.
I don't think they're disagreeing with each other so much. The Rambam famously says that the Rif was correct with a very, very small number of exceptions. I believe he says they can't possibly reach the number of 30, which when you look at the corpus of Halacha is a remarkably small percentage. If you actually count, you might get to a little bit more, but I think the Rambam is very much within the tradition that descends from the Geonim through the Rif.
Okay, any other final questions? Okay, with that, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Brody. Make sure everyone to stay tuned for all the Sunday specials we have this month, and also to sign up for the membership, the new and exciting program we're going to be launching soon. And have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Is there a way that we can have the written document sent to us?
Yes, we have the document. So